In the second half of our introduction to race, ethnicity, and sociology, we're going to be focusing on race and ethnicity, defining these terms, differentiating between them, and looking at the overlaps between them as well. Another thing that we're going to be doing is looking at some of the explanations for racial formation or racialization, and some of the justifications and rationalizations that come with them. Again, this is just kind of skimming over the surface, and so you're really going to want to dig into your reading and text to make sure you get everything you can get in understanding where this idea of race comes from and how integral it now is in our society. So let's go. So let's nail down some terminology that's really important for studying race from a sociological perspective. And that begins with the term and concept of race itself. From your reading, you've probably already seen that race just refers to a group that is set apart from others based on phenotype. And phenotype simply means those physical characteristics that are surface level. So things like skin color, eye shape, mouth, nose shape, hair texture and color, eye color, and so on. These are features that have a social significance, although really there's few real differences between them, right? And so we can observe these phenotypes, we can observe these physical traits, but that's really all that they are. Beyond that surface level, they don't hold much meaning. So, for example, if we look at something called genotype, which refers to a person's genetic makeup, we see that people of varying races share 99.9% of the same DNA. Again, 99.9% of the same DNA. And less than 0.1%, right, or 0.01% of all of the DNA in your body accounts for those physical differences between racial backgrounds. It makes little difference genetically. Race simply does not exist genetically, which means that race is what? It's a social construction, right? And that social construction is dynamic. It is not static. It is constantly evolving. How we classify race via this social construction and what it means can change like that. The persistence of race and its social significance is due to our social insistence. Okay? It is all socially constructed. When it comes to ethnicity, this actually differs from race. And ethnicity, I like to say, is a bit more real than race. Ethnicity is basically looking at a shared social, cultural, and historical experience, a shared heritage and background. It's more so looking at a subculture or subgroups of a society. And so ethnicity is actually based on a sense of identity and a shared identity, a sense of belonging. And typically, there are some real experiences that separate one ethnicity from another. Again, social, cultural, and historical experiences. And that can just be based on living in different places and in different climates with different forms of economy and different social systems and governance, religion, language, all of those things. Right? And so that's why I say ethnicity actually has a bit more ground to stand on than race does. Now, racism is a system of belief. Racism is basically um, the idea that one racial group, remember, based on these social constructions, is superior to another racial group. And typically it's the belief that your racial group is the superior one. And when it comes to racism, we usually look at three key beliefs that center racist thinking. And if you have these three beliefs in play, anyone can be racist, right? Any group can be exerting racism on another. Any individuals can be exerting racism on another. So the first belief here is that humans are divided into distinct bloodlines or physical types. The belief that there's something actually different about their bodies, about their blood that makes them different or inferior or superior to another. So that goes into the second key belief, that those bloodlines, that those physical traits are actually linked to distinct cultures, behaviors, personalities, and intellectual abilities. Not where you're from, right? Not your experiences, but the bloodlines or the skin color or the phenotypes themselves. That those things make you inherently different. And then finally, that certain groups are superior to others, right? So humans are divided into distinct bloodlines or physical types, that those bloodlines and physical types are linked to distinct cultures, behaviors, personalities, and intellectual abilities, and then that certain groups are superior to others based on the above. Okay? And so if you think about those definitions, you can probably think of some examples of racism, of people that you either may know or have heard of, past, present, that have exhibited racist thoughts. So, the social construction of race, or this process by which people come to define a group based not only on physical characteristics, but also their historical and culture and economic factors, is based in racialization. So, racialization is a process of ranking people on the basis of their presented race. Okay. And so, one of the ways of doing this or forming race is perhaps using science or using a narrative of some sort. Um, and whatever process is used, we call that racial formation. And this is a socio-historical process in which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed, all, all in a moment. So some examples of this racial formation would be something like a reservation system for Native Americans and Indigenous. The one drop rule, saying that if you have one drop of whatever um, minority blood, then you belong to a certain race or ethnic group, right? Or that you have those characteristics. Ideas about miscegenation or any kind of idea about, interracial mixing, or exogamy, outmarriage that actually has some sort of um, ranking on those mixes, that may be looking at some form of breeding in some way. And then even looking at othering, right? Of the idea of saying that a group of people is other, that there is a norm, and everyone who doesn't fall into that norm is an other. And we even seen this in the past, in the US, especially with the othering of other white ethnic groups, right? So Eastern Europeans versus Western Europeans and things like that. We don't have to look back too far to see examples of, for example, the Irish who weren't viewed as being white, right? Who weren't afforded um, the um, the benefits of whiteness for a very long time until it became um, helpful or beneficial for other whites. So typically, we have these processes where we define what a race is and figure out who receives more benefits than others and more power and privilege than others. And so the major effect of racial categorization then is defining who has more power and privilege than others. And then those racial constructs include political meanings and social meanings. Okay. And so that's why sociologists still find them socially significant, because we still see those political and social meanings showing up in our statistics, right? In the data analysis that we do, we see that there are some people who are identified with certain races or some groups who are faring well or better in society than others. And so that's why it's important that we still ask people what is their race, because we still have these differences. And so until those differences no longer exist, we still have to ask those questions so that we know where the fight is. We know what to tackle. So again, while there are no biologically transmitted traits, the similarities or differences are only superficial Individuals of all races are members of one single biological species. And so, again, just repeating the same thing over and over again, no systematic genetic differences between people of different races that influence their social behavior or abilities. But still, in social life, race is real with real consequences. And so we see some of that consequence at the level of our social institutions. And so it's important that you understand that a lot of the times when we're talking about race and racism, we're going to be looking at some macro level theory or large level scaled theory. And so that's where we look into social institutions. Social institutions are these complex groups of interdependent positions that together perform a social role and reproduce themselves overall, right? They are a collection of relevant relationships and meanings, and they're a grand narrative made up of our individual stories, right? Um, and so if you look at our society, we have several social institutions that are grand, right? We know them on a micro level as well in our individual personal day-to-day lives, but they exist and are modeled on macro level institutions. And so examples would be something like the family, not your family, right? And not families like in your community and neighborhood, but the society-wide idea of what the family is and what purpose it serves. That's a social institution, right? Those values, those judgments, those behaviors and norms and patterns that we've all constructed together and committed to about what family is supposed to be or what it's supposed to look like, that is a social institution. Likewise, we have ideas about, on a grand scale, as a grand narrative, education, religion, right? The media, government, law and policy, work and economy, as well as health and sport, right? And so we don't need to look at an individual team or an individual church or synagogue or temple, an individual mosque, an individual family, or an individual school in order to understand the grand scheme of the concept, right? We have all these different intricate, smaller, micro level groups that reflect these grand narratives or social institutions, and they have their own variations. But overall, there are some characteristics, right, that they share, and they continue to reproduce themselves typically in a similar model, right? So that's what a social institution is, this grand narrative. And our social institutions, because they're made up of our society members, right, and especially those who are powerful in society, they're also influenced by the interests of those especially powerful members of our society. And so that means that if we have racist, powerful members in our society, or those with racist thinking or racist policies, then they're going to influence how our social institutions operate. Okay. And that's a lot of what the focus of this course is on. Those social institutions, as well as the individuals and the powerful interests that sway those social institutions. All right, so since we're going macro, let's look at how we have traditionally observed inequality of any sort on a macro level. So as sociologies, traditionally we use the terms majority and minority, but because that trips people up so much and thinking about this numerical quantity, um, they often are terms that we tend to shy away from nowadays, even though I still use them interchangeably with the replacement terms like dominant and subordinate. Because majority and minority are not about a numerical number of people representing a certain race or or group, right? But about power, right? And so looking at any sort of interaction and identifying on a macro level who has the majority of the power and who has the minority of the power. And we know that within our own society, it doesn't necessarily coincide or line up with the numerical majority or minority. Okay. And so here are some of the characteristics we see when it comes to subordinate / minority groups in particular, regardless of their actual number. Okay. One is that they receive unequal treatment, right? And that they are overwhelmingly affected unequally by our social institutions, right? That those social institutions are typically not made up in a way that will benefit them and may actually work against them. That they share phenotypes, perhaps, that they belong to groups where there is a distinct phenotype and that phenotype is shared. That phenotype may be viewed as an other phenotype. That they typically, like the membership that belongs to those groups is ascribed. And so that means that they receive that membership by birth. It's not by choice, typically. It's written into their life from the very beginning. And so typically, not always, but typically, ascribed status means that something you're born with, something that you cannot at least easily change, like skin color, right? Or like one's sexuality or something like that, or sexual identity to be more specific. There is usually solidarity, right? There's usually this view of being a part of an in group and seeing like an us versus them sort of dynamic. And another thing is that we often see that there's in-group marriage, right? That those relationships are usually endogamous, and that people who are minorities will typically marry or mate or whatever term you want to use with people who are also minorities, and particularly within their own minority group or subordinate group. And so these are usually the characteristics. And what it all comes down to, combining all these characteristics, is that they typically will have less control or less power over their own lives and definitely over the lives of others. And this is particularly of interest when it comes to, or when it concerns, their economic and political power. So the social
I'd like to go
construction of
back to a
race, or this
question
process
that I
by which
posed on a
people come to
previous slide,
define a group based
and
not
that
only on
is
physical
how does
characteristics,
racism
but also their
differ
historical
from
and culture and
ethnocentricity?
economic factors, is based
Ethnocentricity
in
is a belief that one
racialization.
culture
So
is superior to
racialization is
another,
a
similar
process
to
of ranking
racism, right?
people
There's
on
this
the
element of
basis of their
superiority.
presented race.
But the difference
Okay,
here isn't in
and
necessarily the
so
people, but in the
one of the ways of
practices,
doing
right?
this,
So
or
culture is the
forming race,
totality of
is perhaps
learned
using
socially
science or
transmitted customs,
using a
knowledge,
narrative
material,
of
objects, and behavior.
some sort.
And so cultures, even among
And
racial groups,
whatever process is
can
used,
be
we call
diverse,
that
just like
racial
ethnicities
formation.
among racial groups can
And
also
this
be
is a
diverse, right?
socio-historical process
And
in which
so
racial
when it comes
categories
to
are
culture,
created, inhabited,
people
transformed, and
tend to
destroyed. Be at least
all
somewhat ethnocentric,
all in a
to view
moment.
their own culture
So
as the
some examples
standard
of
or the
this racial
norm,
formation would be something
and or
like a
as being
reservation
superior to
system
others.
for Native
And so
Americans
that
and
might include
indigenous.
judging other
The
cultures
one
by
drop
one's
rule,
own
saying that if you
culture,
have
a
one
comparison
drop
to your
of
own culture as
whatever
the norm or as the right way to do things.
minority blood,
And
then
again, most of us are
you belong
taught
to a certain race
that,
or
our
ethnicity,
own schools or
right?
our own
Or that
countries
you
or
have those
whatever, our
characteristics.
food, whatever, is the
Ideas
best,
about
right?
miscegenation or
Some
any
sort of
kind of idea about,
nationalism,
interracial
patriotism,
mixing, it evokes an
or
element of
exogamy,
outmarriage
ethnocentrism.
that actually has some sort of
Sociologists push us to
um,
at least achieve some level of
ranking
cultural
on
relativism.
those
So that means viewing
mixes
people's
that may
behavior
be looking
as
at
from the
some form of
perspective of
breeding in
their
some
own
way.
culture.
And
And
then
so
even
instead of
looking at
looking at
othering,
another
right? The
ethnic group's
idea of saying
behavior
that
and
a
comparing it to
group of
my
people
culture,
is
I
other, that there is a
compare it
norm,
instead,
and
into the
everyone who
norms
doesn't fall into
within
that norm is
that
an
ethnic
other.
group's
And we
culture.
even seen this in the past, in the US, especially
So
with
you can see
the
a bit
othering of other
that
white ethnic
these
groups,
things,
right? So Eastern
racism and
Europeans versus
ethnocentrism,
Western
that they
Europeans and things like
share
that.
some
We
characteristics like
can
that
we don't have to look back
superiority,
too far to
but
see
that they are
examples
also
of,
social
for
constructions,
example,
and
the
that they can
Irish
be
who weren't viewed
manipulated,
as being
right,
white,
as a social
right? Who weren't
construction. We
afforded
can even manipulate
the
something that seems a bit more real, like
benefit of
ethnocentrism,
whiteness for a
right,
very long
or
time until
like
it
culture or
became Sorry, or ethnicity. There's a lot of words getting jumbled
helpful
up here.
or beneficial for other
And
right.
kind of meld them into one
So
another.
typically we
Because one
have
thing you'll
these
notice
processes
is that in some
where
examples, we
ethnicity and
find
race are actually
what a
used
race
hand in
is,
hand. Now,
and
typically this is not
figure
true,
out
but we do have some
who
examples where
receives
race and
more
ethnicity
benefits than
actually
others and more
overlap.
power and
All right,
privilege
and
than
so let's look at
others.
one of those examples
And
here
so the
and how
major
that's
effect of
changed,
racial
right? An
categorization
example of
then
how it's
is defining
dynamic.
who has more power and
So I'd like to
privilege than
go back to a
others.
question
And
that I
then
posed on a
those racial
previous slide,
constructs
and
include
that
political
is
meanings
how does
and
racism
social meanings.
differ from
Okay.
ethnocentricity?
And so that's why sociologists still
Ethnocentricity
find them
is a
socially
belief that one
significant, because
culture
we still
is superior
see
to
those
another,
political and
similar to
social meanings
racism,
showing up
right?
in our
There's that element of
statistics,
superiority.
right? In the data
But the
analysis
difference
that we
here isn't
do,
in
we see
necessarily the
that
people,
there are
but in
some
the
people who have
practices, right?
identified
So
who are
culture is the
identified with
totality of
certain
learned,
races or some
socially
groups
transmitted customs,
who
knowledge,
are
material, objects,
faring
and behavior.
well or
And so
better in
cultures,
society than
even
others.
among
And so
racial
that's why it's
groups,
important that we still ask
can
people
be
what is
diverse, just like
their race,
ethnicities
because we
among
still have
racial
these
groups can
differences.
also be
And so
diverse,
until those
right?
differences no longer exist,
And
we still
so
have to
when
ask
it
those
comes to
questions so that
culture,
we know where the
people
fight is. We
tend
know what to
to
tackle.
be.
So here's one example, and you might have already caught this earlier. If you did, just wait for a moment, right? Don't spoil it. But look at this example and think, who could it be? They are distinctly marked: the small and somewhat upturned nose, the black tint of the skin. They are ignorant, and as a consequence thereof, are idle, thriftless, poor, intemperate, and barbarian. Of course, they will violate our laws, these wild bisons leaping over the fences which easily restrain the civilized domestic cattle, will commit great crimes of violence, even capital offenses, which certainly have increased as of late. Who could it be? So, if you're thinking about this from a racial perspective, right, you might be thinking, oh, obviously it must be, it's written in English here, right? We can see this image here. We see Uncle Sam, so we know it's relevant to the United States. You can see in the image like 76, abolished is written there, and other words that look very familiar. And so we might be thinking this must be the enslaved people of the US. This must be like Black people. It says the black tint of the skin. It might be natives or indigenous people. Um, Obvious. But the reality is that we're not looking at a racial distinction here. We're actually looking at an ethnic distinction. And who is being spoken about here is Irishmen or Irish people in the United States, those immigrants to the US, who had not been viewed as white previously, right? They did not view them as having a shared sense of identity, as having a shared sense of belonging, right? And actually looked at those symbolic ethnicity signs, right? Things like the food, the music, the clothing, and used that as a way to say that their culture was inferior, right? And this stigma was as deeply tainting of their skin, even as race. And we can see that historically that has changed, right? It hasn't completely been wiped away by history and time, but a lot of that has dissolved to the extent where people don't say, well, what kind of white are you? Or anything like that, or walk up to white people and say, where are you from? Who are your people? Typically, they're accepted as white. And especially for others, we view them, and I say we because I'm from a community of others, usually as being white and belonging to whiteness. Right? And so it's really, really interesting how those lines can blur and cross, and how they can, be used for division or be used for a shared sense of identity or solidarity as well. So really interesting in looking at how race and ethnicity are involved in the idea of racial formation. It's all kind of jumbled up. It's a hot mess, right? And so we're going to be working on doing a bit of untangling and exploration and understanding, right? Some of this goes into something called cultural intelligence, and other areas go into cultural competence and how important they are for understanding culture and ethnicity. Cultural intelligence describes this ability to communicate and interact with others of varying backgrounds and cultures, awareness of biases, and respect for others' uniqueness. And so that can help with developing this cultural relativism. Cultural competence is an awareness for one's own cultural identity, a self awareness, self education, right? An acknowledgement of interaction and understanding how your own cultural identity has been composed, a competence of your own cultural identity. So let's return for a moment to that racialization that we brought up earlier. And let's look at some of the racist framings of race, right? The term race and its existence altogether, the categories of race, this understanding of difference between peoples based not on ethnicity, but based on phenotype, is racism. Okay, it is embedded in racism, right? This idea of ranking people, this racialization, it's not old, it's very new. And it is the inception, like the conception of racism in the world. And so scientific racism, right? This idea that, that race was embedded in science was part of the initial justification and rationalization for racism, right? So science was used as an authority to justify and legitimize race. And so we started with these ideas, right, of four categories of races based on embodiment. And so of Europeans, of South Asians, of North Africans, of Americans, right? And then again, looking at Africa proper, then Asia proper, and then the lapse, and saying that these were distinct categories based on shared phenotypes across these four. Right. And if you're a little confused, look to your text. Your text has a lot of explanation of this and review of the four categories of races. We had this guy named Blumenbach, and this guy basically was thought of as being the founder of anthropology and is who we thank for the study of phrenology, which phrenology, when I first learned about it decades ago, is laughable. It was a pseudoscience that we actually believed in, of classifying people based on their skulls and the bumps along their skulls and the shapes and the sizes of our skulls. And so they would look at these skulls, Caucasian skulls, Mongoloid skulls, Ethiopian, American, and Malay, and try to guess, who had the best skull qualities. What do you think the outcome was? Of course, it was the Caucasian skulls were ranked as the best. Because again, who's forming the narrative? Okay. And so this led into racial formations, right? These understandings that were justified. And then it led into some other scandalous thought systems like social Darwinism, coined by this guy, Herbert Spencer, a horrible sociologist, who basically claimed that we should have a survival of the fittest based on socially being fit, right? And so we shouldn't be helping the poor. We shouldn't be helping the meek, the impoverished, but just kind of letting them die because they were socially unfit. And that was a result, of course, of their genes, right? And so eugenics in the United States and beyond was inspired by social Darwinism, inspired by Herbert Spencer. It was put into place by many others in the United States. Margaret Sanger was one who we know well through the controversy that is Planned Parenthood now, who we thank for Planned Parenthood now, but who we also are very much aware of the racist roots of Planned Parenthood. So you should go take a look at that. It is a hot mess. So yeah, thanks for that. But your history is a bit of a kerfuffle. So yeah. Sociology is also controversial in some of its thought. For the most part, we're typically progressive. We typically are not racist. But you can see that we did have some sociologists who use their powers for evil. So this is just one example.